Most of the seasonal cards I got this year for Christmas and New Year had the following sentence in them, written in different ways but expressing the same sentiment. Hope 2015 is going to be better than the last year. And this was a general sentiment because people felt that the disasters of 2014 couldn't get worse. And barely were we into January when we realized that this year was going to be the same as last year and probably get worse. What happened? An event in Paris, which is now, of course, globally known, shook France and indeed the world. Two brothers, Muslim, of French and Maghrebian origin, went into the offices of Charlie Hebdo, a satirical magazine, of which more later, and shot dead all the cartoonists of the magazine, including the security guard designed to help save the life of Sharp, the editor. It was a very carefully planned, well-organized operation, and then they fled. And for the day after the police was in search of them, an attempt to create a diversion by a collaborator of theirs by occupying a kosher market, a Jewish market in Paris itself failed. He took 4 hostages. The 2 brothers were holed up elsewhere in a print shop where they had sought refuge, and they came out guns blazing, obviously wanting to die, were shot dead. Ahmed Kolabi, French African, who had taken them hostage, was killed, as were the hostages, by the French police. So the operation, in terms of military might, was over very quickly. Those who had carried out these atrocities, and on that, let there be no doubt, they were atrocities. Going in and killing journalists because you dislike what they've done is unacceptable behavior, and everyone said so. I don't think there was any state or any group, apart from the group which, as we later found out, had orchestrated it, which supported this particular event. And then something happens which has always happened after events of this sort. The most dramatic, of course, was 9/11 in the United States, where the imperial power itself, with all its might, was hit in its financial center, Twin Towers, and in its military center, the Pentagon. And how that was instrumentalized, we know. It's now public knowledge, and has been for some time, that Condoleezza Rice, in the Bush White House, said to the National Security Council meeting, we must now use this to get our own way elsewhere in the world. And used it was. And the way it was used, with the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, with the following invasion and occupation of Iraq, set off a new cycle of events which finally ended up in Paris. In between, there was the bomb attack on the Madrid train. There was July the 7th in Britain, where a group of young Muslims from Yorkshire came and let off bombs in the heart of London, killing innocent civilians in a city which in its large majority had been opposed to the Iraq War. And then we have the events in Paris. Now, the difference between the Paris events is that they are similar in character, if not scale, to 9/11. 9/11 was a dramatic event. It revealed, apart from anything else, the power of the image, the spectacle, The whole world saw it. That image of the towers coming down was repeated endlessly for day after day after day on global television networks. The hits on the Pentagon, less so, because they were not as dramatic. But in the case of Paris, it was not exactly the same. Here, the masterminds behind the plan, which are now revealed to be Al-Qaeda, the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Egyptian militant, has said that this was carried out on the instructions of their branch in Yemen, and that is from where it was orchestrated. And clearly, not only military scale planning, but political planning had gone into it. They knew the effect this would have on France, and they didn't care a damn. In fact, they were pleased. And they knew what the result would be: mega outrage. Not on the scale of 9/11, because France isn't an imperial power on that scale. It's a junior imperial power with a few colonies, not much more than that. So that was not what they were aiming at. They were aiming to shock and outrage France, and presumably to make France think a bit as to what was going on in that country. Because these two young brothers in particular who carried out the attacks were pure products of French society. They were French. They happened to have a different religion. They had grown up in France in bad conditions. They had been educated. They had long hair. They smoked marijuana and other substances, happy-go-lucky boys. Till what? Till the Iraq War. That war radicalized them. And where did they go for help? They went to the mosque. There was nowhere else for them to go, and they went to the mosque to seek advice, to say what could they do? And there they were waiting hardliners, as there are in most mosques. Not everyone who goes to the mosque is a jihadi hardliner, but some are. And these kids went there. And what happened is now history. They met jihadis, they were recruited to Al-Qaeda, they were taken to Iraq to participate in a war, they came back to France, they went then to Syria to fight in the war to topple Assad. And here there's a bit of a mystery. When they went to Syria, did the French intelligence services know? So far, no answers. But certainly the United States had these two kids on their list of potential terrorists who were not to be allowed to board a plane into the United States. So they must be on some list. And we know full well that France was heavily engaged behind the scenes in the war to topple Assad. It had got its agents in the security services in Syria, in the Syrian army, to pull out, to try and weaken the army, carry out a similar operation as was carried out in Libya. And they were encouraging people to go, as was Britain, by the way, to go and fight to topple Assad. Now, if these kids went to Syria on the say-so of French intelligence, then it makes the episode we have recently witnessed somewhat sinister. Why weren't they watched when they came back? Where is this much vaunted surveillance which takes place in every European country today? Didn't work? What happened? We still have not got all the answers to this puzzle. What we do know, and what is still going on, is the way in which the French state instrumentalized the event and used it for its own benefit. And what was at the heart of the response of the French elite and the French establishment and the French media, with few exceptions, was not to pose any serious questions at all. This was a civilizational conflict. This was a conflict between good and evil. This was a conflict between Islam and the rest of the world, and every single Islamophobic response imaginable emerged in the French and the European press. And the demonstration that took place, a demonstration of French national unity, with European and friendly Arab leaders coming to express their solidarity with France, never asked the question, or the people who came, never asked the question, why? One reason why is the double standards that operate on the question of freedoms, on the question of who can say what and when, on the question of Israel-Palestine, and one of the major factors responsible for radicalizing young Muslims and sending them off or pushing them in the direction of hardline jihadi groups was actually on the front of the demonstration, Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister who the French state, let it be known, had barged his way in, first to the country and then to the demonstrations. A bit difficult to believe because it could have been stopped had they wanted to. But he marched in the front, said that French Jews were being killed now again, and pleaded with French Jews to turn their backs on France and migrate to Israel. Presumably, the thinking here was that they would be happier off in a segregated apartheid state where Arabs were second-class citizens and were kept seriously under control and weren't usually threatening because they were watched all the time. Who were the other figures on the demonstration? Because looking at them helps to see what was represented that day in France. If you look now at the list, there's Bibi Netanyahu in the section of the photograph which went all over the world with a Mossad security guard, one assumes, with his hand on his shoulder, ready to pull him down at the first threat of terror, danger, sniper. Next to him is the president of Mali, a country currently occupied by French troops. And why is Mali occupied by French troops? Because toppling Gaddafi resulted in a large-scale expulsion of Africans, dark-skinned Africans, from Libya by the new dispensation. Many of them then went back to Mali from where they were and created mayhem, took Timbuktu, threatened the government in power, and French troops had to be sent in. So it was argued by Paris in order to prevent jihadism from taking over, not seeing that their own role in Libya in toppling Gaddafi had something to do with it. So the president of Mali, sustained in power by French troops, was of course on the front line between Netanyahu and Hollande. Next to Hollande was the Queen of Europe, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, the single most important politician in Europe today, representing the most important country in Europe, which is also riddled with problems and where Islamophobia now is climbing each and every day. And she came to a France from her own country where that same week there had been demonstrations in 2 or 3 major German cities effectively against Muslims, under the banner of an organization which calls itself Pegida, Peoples of Europe Against the Islamization of Europe. And this sort of rhetoric in Germany, which has been on the fringes for a while, is now becoming increasingly mainstream. And what the Germans are having to do to bail out Europe is itself giving way to a form of German nationalism disguised by using the word Europe. So it's not PGGIDA, the peoples of Germany against the Islamization. It's the peoples of Europe against the Islamization of Europe. In itself, a totally bizarre and absurd concept. To her credit, Merkel attacked this and later participated, after she returned from this demonstration, in a demonstration organized by German Muslims to protest and to defend their rights as German citizens. And she and her cabinet did turn up at that march in Berlin. But she knows that it's an extremely critical time for the European Union, and the last thing they need is an outbreak of hostility against minorities. Then we have, next to her, Donald Tusk, the nominal president of the European Council. It's Poland's turn, and effectively a non-entity, a figure of nil importance, and carries out the instructions which are given by essentially the German elite at the moment. Next to him, we have two other figures, President Abbas of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and just on his left is King Abdullah of Jordan. So it's a strange gathering of people, basically there for the photo op that it provided, and to show that the European elite, with its backers elsewhere, is united against this outrage. Now, the outrage itself raises a whole number of questions. What are they? The first is there any such thing as absolute freedom in this world, where anyone, regardless of who he or she is, can say anything that they want? Like hell there is. In France itself, where this big brouhaha is now being mounted, there are laws to prevent hate being targeted against people likely to lead to violence. It's a very broad law, and so far it has been applied largely against those who the state regards as people hostile to it. France was the only country in the Western world that banned demonstrations in favor of Palestine during Israel's assault on Gaza. No other country did. France did. It is illegal in France to question the figures of the Holocaust or the fact that the Holocaust took place. Now, I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing for the moment. I'm saying these are the laws in force. So there is one law in effect for not insulting Jewish people, but this law is never applied when it comes to the large minority of Muslims who live in France. And this is one fact which creates a great deal of anger, because the double standards are there on display. And treating people, whether Jews, Muslims, or Roma, as a monolithic block, not understanding that within these communities there are differences, is something actually that was popularized during the Third Reich in Germany. That particular notion, all Jews are the same. Kill them. The attacks that are being made on Islam are not dissimilar. Many Muslims, in fact a large majority of Muslims or people of Muslim origin who are not religious, have denounced jihadi violence, because it doesn't only take place in France. The West wakes up when some cartoonists in a supposedly satirical magazine are killed. Charlie Hebdo, which started off in the 70s as a radical left magazine, has changed as France has changed. As the French intellectuals moved to the right, as many of them embraced Zionism, so did Charlie Hebdo, and most of the cartoonists working for it. And in this situation, to publish utterly vile and disgraceful cartoons of one faith, but not the other, what is it if not a provocation? And then what follows? 2 days after this march in Paris, the founder of this magazine, Charlie Hebdo, It used to be called Harakiri Hebdo when it was founded. It was banned by the French government in the 70s twice for offending the French government. It was banned. There was no talk then of freedom of the press, or vigils, or big demos, or shock, horror, anger. So the question of absolute freedom, the right to say whatever you want, regardless of its outcome, has resulted in the atrocities that we saw in the offices of Charlie Hebdo. Interestingly enough, an opinion poll released in France 4 days after this demonstration revealed what? Just 4 days. That 57% of French people, when interviewed, said yes, they would support the right of magazines to carry on operating the same way, but 42% said they were completely opposed to magazines insulting particular religions, especially Islam. And the age, the generational difference is very clear. So the generational shift that is taking place, people who have grown up or born 20 years ago, French kids of Arab origin, know that the world is changing. It is not the society of the 50s or the 60s or the 70s which their parents and grandparents knew. So even within France, a shift is taking place, and that, of course, is very positive. But the issues themselves are not going to go away. And that is why the events in Paris should actually raise the warning flag for the entire European elite, because it's not unrelated to the austerity measures at home, which people are now targeting immigrants rather than politicians who are carrying out these austerity measures. The wars that are being fought in French Africa and in the Arab world, which are further radicalizing young Muslims, not just in the ghettos of Western Europe or North America, but in the Arab world itself, because they see no alternatives whatsoever. These are the long-term problems that have to be dealt with, and these are the causes which politicians don't wish to look at. And until they do, effectively what we're going to see in different shapes and forms is more acts of terror like this. We have had terrorists who call themselves as such in parts of eastern India and northern India during the British occupation of that subcontinent, who targeted British officers, British civil servants who had been responsible for particularly unpleasant activities on that continent. And we then had the war in Algeria, the colonial war waged by France to prevent Algeria becoming independent, in which acts of terror were carried out by the Algerian National Liberation Front. And when the leader of the National Liberation Front was asked, why do you throw these bombs in cafes and kill people, he said, because we don't have an air force. And if the French were to share their air force with us, we promised we would target people more carefully and we would target military buildings and military headquarters. So terrorism, let's be honest and blunt about this in the spirit of freedom of speech, is the weapon of the poor. It's the weapon of people who have no other recourse. And this is what they have been using since the United States occupied Saudi Arabia in the first Gulf War to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in the 90s. That is what has been happening. People have been getting radicalized. There's no left worth speaking of. The nationalist currents in the Arab world have gone. All that is now left is Islam. And here too, Islam is not a monolithic, unified religion. So the argument that is often made by liberals and Muslim liberals they don't speak for Islam, these people. This is true. They don't speak for Islam as a whole. But who does? Nobody. There is a sort of peripheral debate within Islam as to whether the Prophet of Islam should ever be represented. And they use Quranic ideas, or supposedly sayings from the Quran, to say that the Prophet was opposed to this. Well, there's no evidence of that in the Quran, a document I have read a couple of times. What the Quran says, like the Old Testament and the Torah, it's derived from that, is we are not in favor of the worship of graven images, idolatry, worshipping statues. That's forbidden in Judaism, and that's forbidden in Islam. And some of the criticisms of Christianity made by both Jews and Muslims has been that it went too far in accommodating the ancient gods and the ancient belief systems by making Jesus and Mary into figures to be worshipped. But there is nothing to say that they should not be represented. So this is largely a debate within Islam, which has now become a huge debate within European society as a whole. Meanwhile, in France itself, a strange truce now prevails. People are nervous, people are frightened, and ask whether this might happen again. Who knows? As long as the wars continue, as long as unemployment stays at the same level, as long as people live precariously, who knows whether it'll happen again, or whether it'll happen in France or somewhere else in the world, Europe, the Arab world. Conditions remain very volatile, and therefore one has to remain on guard on every level, intellectually, politically. But one must not fall prey to the pieties and sanctimoniousness of the European elites and the media that follows them blindly. In a mainstream media on a European and global level, largely dominated by piety and sanctimoniousness, there was one ray of light. Joe Sacco, the United States cartoonist, produced a cartoonist's response to the Charlie Hebdo crisis, which was brilliant. It spoke for large numbers of voiceless people all over the world.
My first reaction to the murders at the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris was not bold defiance. I did not feel like beating my chest and reaffirming the principles of free speech. My first reaction was sadness. People were brutally killed, among them several cartoonists, my tribe. But along with grief came thoughts about the nature of some of Charlie Hebdo's satire. Though tweaking the noses of Muslims might be as permissible as it is now believed to be dangerous, it has never struck me as anything other than a vapid way to use the pen. Can I play this game too? Sure, I could draw a black man falling out of a tree with a banana in his hand. In fact, I just did. I'm allowed to offend, right? Incidentally, did you know that Charlie Hebdo fired a cartoonist, Maurice Siné, look him up, for allegedly writing an anti-Semitic column? So, with that in mind, here's a Jew counting his money in the entrails of the working class. And if you can take that joke now, would it have been as funny in 1933? In fact, when we draw a line, we are often crossing one too, because lines on paper are a weapon, and satire is meant to cut to the bone. But whose bone? What exactly is the target? And why? Yes, I affirm our right to take the piss. So here is a gratuitous drawing of a true believer doing God's work in the desert. But perhaps when we tire of holding up our middle finger, we can try to think about why the world is the way it is, and what it is about Muslims in this time and place that makes them unable to laugh off a mere image. And if we answer because something is deeply wrong with them, certainly something was deeply wrong with the killers, then let us drive them from their homes and into the sea, for that is going to be far easier than sorting out how we fit in each other's world.